There's something heartbreaking about watching a man lose his purpose after a lifetime of hard work. Ray Kavanaugh had spent 40 years working cattle ranches across Arizona, but now, at 72, with his wife gone and body too worn for ranch life, he lived alone in a desert cabin with only his German shepherd Duke for company. Most days passed quietly until Duke started bringing home strange rocks from his wanderings. Ray dismissed them at first, just another quirk from his aging companion. But when the rocks kept coming, larger and oddly shaped, curiosity got the better of him. What he discovered would change everything he knew about his family's land. But what had Duke been finding in the desert? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something special for you. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in all directions from Ray Kavanaugh's weathered porch, a landscape of muted browns and sage greens that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. At this hour, just past 6 in the morning, the air still held a hint of coolness that would vanish within an hour, replaced by the relentless heat that made even the lizards seek shade. Ray sat in his grandfather's rocking chair, a cup of black coffee growing cold in his hands, watching Duke nose around the collection of rocks that had accumulated near the front steps over the past month. 40 years. That's how long he'd spent working ranches from Tucson to Flagstaff, his hands growing thick and calloused from rope burns and fence wire, his back bent from countless hours in the saddle. He could still remember the morning he'd met Margaret at the feed store in Prescott. Her laugh had cut through the dusty air like a bell, clear and true. She'd followed him to 7 different ranches over the decades, never complaining about the constant moves, the modest quarters, or the uncertainty that came with ranch work. Even when they'd finally scraped together enough to buy this small plot of desert land 30 miles outside Phoenix, she'd called it their palace. The cancer took her 2 years ago. Ray's hands tightened around the coffee mug as he pushed that thought away, focusing instead on Duke's methodical investigation of his growing rock collection. The German shepherd was 8 years old now, still strong and alert, but Ray could see the grey creeping into his muzzle. They'd gotten Duke as a puppy when Margaret was already sick, though neither of them had admitted it at the time. She'd insisted they needed something to keep Ray busy when she was gone. As if he'd known he was being thought about, Duke trotted over and dropped something at Ray's feet with a satisfied thump. Another rock. This one was about the size of a softball, irregular in shape, with one smooth side that caught the early morning light. Ray sighed and reached down to pat Duke's head. "What am I supposed to do with all these, boy?" Duke's tail wagged. Once then, he padded back toward the makeshift collection he'd been assembling. Ray counted them again. 17 rocks now, all different sizes and shapes, all retrieved from Duke's daily wanderings into the desert. Some were clearly just stones weathered by wind and sand, but others had odd angles and curves that didn't seem entirely natural. The routine had started innocently enough. Ray would let Duke out each morning after breakfast, and the dog would disappear into the desert for an hour or two, following scents and chasing shadows. Ray had always appreciated the solitude. It gave him time to tend to the small vegetable garden Margaret had started, to maintain the solar panels that powered their modest cabin, to simply sit and think without the weight of another person's expectations. But lately, Duke had started coming back with these rocks, carrying them carefully in his mouth like precious gifts. Ray's property sat on 43 acres of what most people would call wasteland, scrub brush, scattered cacti, and red dirt that hadn't seen significant rainfall in months. But Margaret had seen something more. She'd planted desert wildflowers along the path to their front door, coaxed a small oasis of green around their cabin with careful irrigation, and spent hours sitting on this same porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Henderson, 5 miles down a dirt road that barely deserved the name. She stopped by once a week with groceries and news from town, though Ray suspected the visits were more about checking on his well-being than any real need for social interaction. At 72, he'd reached that age where people started watching for signs of decline, ready to suggest assisted living or family intervention at the first hint of confusion or neglect. Ray stood up slowly, his knees protesting the change in position, and walked over to examine Duke's collection more closely. Most of the rocks were clearly natural, chunks of sandstone and granite smoothed by centuries of wind and weather. But as he knelt down and picked up the one Duke had just brought, something about its surface caught his attention. The smooth side wasn't smooth because of erosion. There were faint lines etched into it, too regular to be natural. Ray turned the rock over in his hands, squinting in the strengthening sunlight. What he'd initially taken for natural weathering looked more like intentional shaping. One edge was clearly chipped in a deliberate pattern, and the surface bore traces of what might have been decoration. He carried the rock inside to the kitchen table, where Margaret's reading glasses still sat in a small ceramic dish she'd made. During a pottery class in Sedona, Ray had never moved them, couldn't bring himself to pack away the small reminders of her presence. Now he put them on and examined the rock under the brighter indoor lighting. There was no doubt about it. This wasn't just a rock. The surface showed clear evidence of human craftsmanship, deliberate shaping, smoothing, and what looked like decorative elements carved into the clay. Because that's what it was, Ray realized. Not stone at all, but fired clay. A piece of pottery, weathered and broken, but unmistakably made by human hands. His heart began to beat a little faster as he thought about the implications. Duke had been ranging perhaps 2 miles from the cabin on his daily expeditions, always heading roughly southwest, toward a shallow wash that cut through the desert floor. If this pottery fragment had come from that area, what else might be out there? Ray had lived on this land for 6 years now, had walked most of it during the early days when he'd been planning improvements and assessing the property. He'd never seen any signs of previous habitation, but then again, he'd never been looking for something like this. His focus had been on practical matters, water sources, soil quality, the best places to string power lines and dig septic systems. But now, holding this fragment of someone else's life in his hands, Ray felt a stirring of something he hadn't experienced in months. Curiosity, purpose, the sense that there were still discoveries to be made, even at his age. Duke wandered back inside and settled on his favorite rug near the kitchen sink, apparently satisfied with his morning's work. Ray looked at him with new appreciation. How long had Duke been bringing these things home? How many had Ray simply dismissed as rocks without bothering to examine them properly? He spent the next hour going through the entire collection, armed with Margaret's reading glasses and a growing sense of excitement. What he'd taken for natural stones revealed themselves to be fragments of pottery, pieces of worked stone, and other artifacts that spoke of human presence. Not recent presence. The wear and weathering suggested these items had been lying exposed to the elements for decades, possibly much longer. Ray had lived his entire adult life working land that other people owned, following orders and implementing plans he'd had no part in making. Even this small plot of desert was the first place he'd ever been able to call truly his own. The idea that others had been here before him, had lived and worked, and perhaps thrived on this same patch of earth, filled him with an emotion he couldn't quite name. By mid-morning, when the heat was becoming unbearable, Ray had identified at least 6 clear pottery fragments, 3 pieces of what looked like worked stone tools, and several other items that defied easy categorization. Each discovery raised new questions. Who had lived here? When? What had happened to them? Ray had never considered himself a particularly curious man. Ranching was practical work that rewarded steady competence over intellectual exploration. But as he sat at Margaret's kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of lives lived long before his own, he felt something awakening in him that he'd thought had died with his wife. The desert suddenly seemed less empty, less finished. Somewhere, out there, in the direction Duke had been wandering, lay answers to questions Ray was only beginning to formulate. And for the first time in 2 years, he found himself genuinely eager to see what tomorrow might bring. 3 days later, Duke brought home something that changed everything. Ray was repairing a section of fence line that had come loose during the last windstorm when he heard Duke's familiar bark, the sharp, excited sound he made when he'd found something particularly interesting. Ray straightened up, shading his eyes against the noon sun, and watched his companion trot across the desert floor with something dark clutched carefully in his mouth. "What you got there, boy?" Duke approached with his usual ceremony, tail wagging but movements deliberate and careful. He dropped his prize at Ray's feet and stepped back, panting lightly in the heat. Ray bent down to pick up what Duke had brought, expecting another pottery fragment or piece of worked stone. Instead, he found himself holding an obsidian arrowhead. There was no mistaking what it was. The black volcanic glass caught the sunlight and threw it back in sharp facets, and every line of the artifact spoke of deliberate, skillful craftsmanship. Ray had seen enough arrowheads in museum displays and trading posts to recognize the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a crude attempt at tool-making. It was the product of generations of knowledge, passed down and refined until the maker could shape stone with the precision of a surgeon. Ray turned the arrowhead over in his weathered palm, marveling at its weight and balance. The point was sharp enough to draw blood, even after what must have been decades or centuries lying in the desert. The edges showed the characteristic flaking pattern of napped obsidian, each chip removed with careful consideration of angle and force. Near the base, he could see the notches where it would have been bound to a shaft with sinew or plant fiber. This wasn't just evidence of human presence on his land. This was evidence of human expertise, of a people who had not just survived in this harsh environment, but had thrived well enough to develop sophisticated hunting technologies. Ray felt his legs grow weak and sat down heavily on a nearby boulder. Duke immediately came over to nuzzle his hand, perhaps sensing his master's emotional shift. The implications of what he was holding began to cascade through Ray's mind, like dominoes falling in sequence. If there were arrowheads on his property, there had been hunters. If there had been hunters, there had been game to hunt. If there had been enough game to support hunters, this desert had once been a very different place, more fertile, better watered, capable of supporting not just individual survival, but an entire community of people with specialized skills. Ray's hands began to shake slightly as he considered what this meant for everything he thought he knew about his land. When he and Margaret had bought this property, the real estate agent had described it as undeveloped desert acreage with no known historical significance. They'd done the required surveys and title searches, had found nothing in the county, records to suggest the land had ever been anything more than empty wilderness. But the arrowhead in his palm told a different story entirely. Ray carefully wrapped the obsidian point in his handkerchief and walked back to the cabin, Duke trotting alongside him. Inside, he placed the arrowhead on the kitchen table next to his growing collection of pottery fragments and studied them together. The pottery fragments had been remarkable enough, evidence that people had lived here, had made vessels for cooking and storage, had possessed the knowledge and leisure time necessary for craft production. But the arrowhead elevated everything to a new level. This suggested not just temporary habitation, but a functioning society. Someone had taken the time to locate obsidian, which didn't occur naturally in this immediate area, and transport it. Here, someone else had possessed the specialized knowledge to work it into a weapon. The arrows this point had tipped had been used to hunt animals that had provided food for families, hides for shelter and clothing, bones for tools and decoration. Ray felt overwhelmed by the sudden realization that his quiet patch of desert might be sitting on top of an entire buried world. He made his way to the small desk where Margaret had kept her computer, an ancient laptop that still connected to the internet through their satellite service, though Ray had barely touched it since her death. Now he powered it up and waited impatiently for it to connect, his mind racing with questions he'd never thought to ask. The first search results for Obsidian Arrowheads, Arizona, yielded thousands of hits. Ray clicked through page after page of archaeological reports, museum collections, and academic papers, trying to understand what he'd stumbled onto. The more he read, the more significant his discoveries seemed to become. Obsidian arrowheads found in this region of Arizona typically dated to anywhere from 500 to 8,000 years ago, depending on their style and the archaeological context in which they were found. The sophisticated knapping technique evident in his specimen suggested it was the work of experienced craftspeople who were part of an established cultural tradition. Ray spent hours reading about the various indigenous peoples who had inhabited central Arizona over the centuries. The Hohokam, who had built extensive irrigation systems, the Sinagua, who had constructed cliff dwellings and Pueblo-style settlements, various Apache and O'odham groups who had maintained hunting and gathering traditions well into the historic period. Each culture had left distinctive artifact patterns, different styles of pottery and toolmaking that archaeologists used to identify and date sites. As the afternoon wore on, Ray's excitement began to mix with a growing sense of unease. Everything he was reading suggested that his property might contain what archaeologists would call a significant cultural resource, the kind of site that required careful study and protection under federal law. Ray had spent his entire working life following other people's rules about land use. Ranch owners had dictated where he could ride, when he could move cattle, how he could maintain fences and water sources. Government regulations had controlled everything from grazing permits to predator management, even after buying his own small piece of desert. He'd had to navigate county building codes, septic system requirements, and zoning restrictions. Now he faced the possibility that his land might be subject to an entirely new set of regulations he'd never considered. Archaeological sites on private property were governed by a complex web of federal and state laws that Ray didn't begin to understand. Would he be required to report his discoveries? Would government archaeologists want to conduct excavations? Would his quiet retirement be invaded by experts and officials and graduate students tramping across his property with clipboards and measuring tapes? The thought made his chest tighten with anxiety. After 2 years of carefully constructed solitude, the idea of his private world being open to outside scrutiny felt almost unbearable. This was supposed to be his sanctuary, the place where he and Margaret had planned to grow old together in peace. Now it might become a field station for people who knew more about his own land than he did. But as Ray looked again at the arrowhead lying on his kitchen table, he realized there was no going back. Duke would continue bringing artifacts home. That much was certain. The dog had developed a clear sense of what his master found interesting and would undoubtedly keep expanding the collection. And Ray's own curiosity, dormant for so long, had been awakened in a way that couldn't be undone. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in familiar shades of red and gold, Ray made a decision that surprised him. Tomorrow, he would follow Duke's trail into the desert and see for himself where these artifacts were coming from. Whatever he found there, and whatever consequences might follow, he owed it to the people who had lived on this land before him to understand their story. The arrowhead seemed to pulse with history in the gathering twilight, and Ray realized his quiet life had just become considerably more complicated. Ray set out before dawn, carrying a backpack with water, Margaret's camera, and a small notebook she'd used for her garden planning. Duke led the way with obvious excitement, his usual morning routine transformed into a purposeful expedition. The desert air was still cool enough to make walking comfortable, and Ray found himself moving with more energy than he'd felt in months. They headed southwest, as Ray had expected, following a faint game trail that wound between stands of palo, verde and cholla cactus. Duke moved with the confident stride of someone following a familiar route, occasionally stopping to sniff at something that caught his interest, but never straying far from their general direction. After about 40 minutes of steady walking, they reached the shallow wash Ray had seen from his property line. The depression was perhaps 20 feet wide and 3 feet deep, carved by flash floods during the rare occasions when serious rain hit the desert. Most of the year it remained bone dry, its sandy bottom marked only by the tracks of small animals and the occasional debris left by seasonal water flow. Duke immediately began casting about in the wash bottom, nose to the ground, tail wagging with the intensity Ray had learned meant a successful hunt was imminent. Within minutes, the dog had located something and began digging with the focused determination of a creature who knew exactly what he was looking for. Ray slid down the gentle bank and approached Duke's excavation site. Even before the dog had finished digging, Ray could see what had caught his attention. A large, flat stone, partially buried in the sandy wash bottom. But as Duke continued to expose the object, Ray realized this wasn't a natural rock formation. The stone was roughly circular, about 18 inches in diameter, with a distinctly concave surface that had been deliberately shaped and smoothed. Ray knelt beside Duke and helped clear away the remaining sand, revealing what was unmistakably a grinding stone, the bottom half of a metate used for processing seeds, grain, and other plant materials. Ray sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the immediacy of what he was seeing. This wasn't just an artifact. It was a tool that someone had used regularly, possibly daily, to prepare food for their family. He could imagine hands working over this stone, crushing mesquite pods or acorn flour, the rhythmic sound of the hand stone against the metate echoing across a landscape that might have been green with grass and dotted with oak trees. As he photographed the grinding stone from multiple angles, Ray began to notice other anomalies in the wash bottom. What he'd initially taken for natural rock formations began to reveal themselves as additional artifacts. A concentration of pottery fragments lay, scattered about 15 feet downstream from the metate. Several pieces of worked stone, not as refined as the obsidian arrowhead, but clearly shaped by human hands, emerged from the sand as Duke continued his enthusiastic digging. The pattern of distribution told a story that Ray was beginning to understand. Flash floods had carried these artifacts from their original locations, depositing them in the wash where seasonal water flow had both preserved and scattered them. But somewhere upstream, somewhere on Ray's property, lay the original site where these tools had been made and used. Ray spent the next 2 hours methodically working his way up the wash, photographing every artifact he found and marking their locations in Margaret's notebook. The concentration of materials was heaviest near the grinding stone, but scattered fragments continued for nearly a quarter-mile upstream, suggesting either a very large site or multiple locations where people had lived and worked. By the time the sun was high enough to make continued searching uncomfortable, Ray had documented more than 30 individual artifacts. Pottery fragments showing different styles and decorative techniques, stone tools in various stages of completion, suggesting this had been a place where people not only used implements, but manufactured them. Even what appeared to be fragments of shell ornaments, though Ray couldn't imagine how marine shells had ended up in the Arizona desert. The walk back to the cabin gave Ray time to process what he'd discovered. This wasn't just evidence of occasional camping or temporary shelter. The variety and quantity of artifacts suggested sustained habitation by people who had developed sophisticated technologies for desert survival. The grinding stone alone represented hours of skilled labor to shape and prepare, not something that would be abandoned lightly. As they approached the cabin, Ray felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar pack saddle. He'd spent his working life caring for other people's land and livestock, and he understood the obligations that came with stewardship. But this was different. These weren't just physical resources to be managed, they were the remnants of human lives, stories that deserved to be told and preserved. That evening, after Duke had settled into his customary position on the kitchen rug, Ray sat at Margaret's computer and began researching archaeological protocols for private landowners. What he found was both reassuring and daunting. Property owners in Arizona weren't legally required to report archaeological finds on their own land, but they were strongly encouraged to contact academic institutions that could help assess and preserve significant discoveries. Ray stared at the phone number for Arizona State University's Department of Anthropology for nearly 10 minutes before finally dialing. A recorded message directed him to Dr. Sarah Martinez, who specialized in prehistoric southwestern cultures. Ray hung up without leaving a message, his courage failing him at the last moment. The truth was, he wasn't sure he was ready for the changes that expert involvement might bring. His discovery was transforming from a personal curiosity into something that might require sharing with strangers, people who would bring their own agendas and interpretations to his land. Part of him wanted to keep the secret to himself and Duke, to explore and learn at his own pace without outside pressure or expectations. But as he looked at the photographs he'd taken that morning, evidence of lives lived with skill and purpose. In this harsh environment, Ray knew he couldn't justify keeping such a discovery private. These people had been here first, had called this place home, had raised children and buried parents, and developed technologies that allowed them to thrive in conditions that challenged even modern residents with solar panels and satellite internet. They deserved better than to have their legacy remain hidden in a wash bottom, slowly eroding away with each seasonal flood. Ray owed them the respect of proper documentation and preservation, even if it meant inviting complexity into his carefully simplified life. Tomorrow, he decided, he would call Dr. Martinez again. This time, he would leave a message. Dr. Sarah. Martinez arrived 3 days later in a dust-covered Toyota pickup that had seen better decades. Ray watched from his porch as a compact woman in her early 30s climbed out of the truck, her long black hair tied back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes clearly chosen for fieldwork rather than academic meetings. She moved with the confident stride of someone comfortable in the desert, and Duke immediately trotted over to investigate the newcomer with tail-wagging approval. "Mr. Kavanaugh, I'm Sarah Martinez. Thank you for calling about your discoveries." Her handshake was firm and direct, her voice carrying a slight accent that Ray couldn't quite place. She had the kind of focused attention he'd seen in good ranch hands. People who could assess a situation quickly and accurately without wasting time on unnecessary conversation. "I have to admit, I wasn't sure what to expect from your message," she continued, reaching down to scratch Duke behind the ears. "But after looking at the photographs you emailed, I cleared my entire afternoon. What you found could be extremely significant." Ray led her to the kitchen table, where he'd arranged his growing collection of artifacts. Sarah's demeanor shifted immediately from polite professionalism to intense scientific interest. She pulled a pair of latex gloves from her pocket and began examining each piece with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to extract maximum information from minimal evidence. "This pottery style is consistent with late prehistoric period, probably between 1000 and 1400 CE, she murmured, turning a fragment over in her hands. "See these incised lines? That's a decorative technique associated with the Hohokam cultural tradition, though this particular pattern is unusual for this area." She picked up the obsidian arrowhead and held it up to the light. Beautiful workmanship. The obsidian probably came from Government Mountain, about 60 miles north of here. That suggests either long-distance trade relationships or seasonal mobility patterns that covered significant territory. Ray found himself studying her face as she worked, noting the genuine excitement that lit her features with each new discovery. This wasn't just academic interest. Sarah clearly felt a personal connection to the people who had created these artifacts, a sense of responsibility for understanding and preserving their stories. Mr. Kavanaugh, would you be willing to show me the site where your dog found these items? I'd like to do a preliminary survey before we discuss next steps. The walk to the wash gave Ray time to observe Sarah's professional methods. She moved carefully through the desert, noting plant communities and geological features, stopping periodically to take GPS readings and photographs. When they reached the area where Duke had been most successful, she spent nearly an hour examining the distribution of artifacts without touching anything. "This is remarkable," she said finally. "The wash has created a natural sorting mechanism, but the original site is definitely upstream from here. Based on the artifact density and variety, I'd estimate we're looking at a substantial habitation area, possibly a seasonal village that was used repeatedly over several generations." Sarah pulled out a small trowel and began carefully excavating around one of the pottery concentrations. Within minutes, she'd uncovered something that made her catch her breath. A small, perfectly preserved turquoise bead, its blue-green surface still showing traces of the original polish. "Ray," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at this." She held up the bead, no larger than a pencil eraser, but Ray could see immediately that it represented something extraordinary. The turquoise was high quality, carefully shaped and drilled with a precision that spoke of specialized tools and expert craftsmanship. More importantly, turquoise meant trade relationships that extended far beyond the immediate area. Turquoise. "This quality probably came from mines in New Mexico or Colorado," Sarah explained. "For it to end up here means these people were connected to trading networks that spanned hundreds of miles. This single bead represents relationships, travel, exchange of goods and ideas across vast distances." Ray felt something shift in his understanding as he looked at the tiny artifact. He'd been thinking of his discoveries in terms of local history, people who had happened to live on what was now his land. But the turquoise bead suggested something much larger and more complex. These weren't isolated desert dwellers scraping out a marginal existence. They were part of a sophisticated regional culture with economic and social connections that stretched across the Southwest. "What happens next?" Ray asked, though he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. Sarah sat back on her heels, clearly, choosing her words carefully. "That depends entirely on what you want to happen. This is your property, and you have every right to manage it as you see fit. But from a scientific perspective, this site has the potential to contribute significantly to our understanding of prehistoric southwestern cultures." She gestured toward the scattered artifacts visible in the wash bottom. "A proper archaeological investigation would involve systematic excavation, detailed mapping, and analysis of everything we find. It would take months, possibly years, to complete properly. It would mean graduate students and visiting researchers, equipment trucks and survey teams." Ray felt his stomach tighten at the prospect. This was exactly what he'd feared. His quiet sanctuary transformed into an academic field station, his privacy invaded by well-meaning strangers with clipboards and measuring tapes. Sarah seemed to sense his hesitation. "On the other hand," she continued, "the site isn't going anywhere. We could start with a small, careful investigation. Just you, me, and maybe one graduate student. Document what's here. Establish the site boundaries. Get a better sense of its significance before making any decisions about larger-scale excavation." The compromise appealed to Ray more than he'd expected. Sarah's obvious respect for both the archaeological materials and his position as landowner suggested she understood the balance between scientific opportunity and personal privacy. More importantly, her enthusiasm was infectious. Ray found himself wanting to learn more about the people who had created the turquoise bead, who had shaped the grinding stone, who had lived and worked on land he now called home. "How would we start?" he asked. Sarah's smile was immediate and transformative. "We start by mapping what Duke has already found. Then we work our way upstream, following the artifact trail back to its source. We document everything carefully, disturb as little as possible, and let the site tell us its own story." As they walked back toward the cabin, Ray found himself looking at his property with completely new eyes. Every rise and depression in the desert floor might hide evidence of human habitation. Every arroyo and wash might contain artifacts that could illuminate the lives of people who had called this place home centuries before his own arrival. Duke trotted alongside them, apparently satisfied that the newcomer met with his approval. Ray suspected the dog understood more about the significance of his discoveries than anyone had given him credit for. 2 weeks into their collaboration, Ray discovered that archaeology was far more meticulous than he'd ever imagined. Sarah had shown him how to establish a grid system using stakes and string, how to excavate in careful layers measured in centimeters rather than inches, and how to document every fragment's exact position before removing it from the ground. What had seemed like simple digging turned out to be more like surgery, precise, patient, and requiring a level of attention to detail that reminded Ray of his father's advice about breaking horses. Go slow if you want to go fast. They worked in the early morning hours when the desert was still cool, starting before sunrise and finishing by 10 o'clock when the heat became unbearable. Sarah had brought a canvas shade structure that they erected over their work area, and Ray had installed a small table where they could clean and examine artifacts without having to carry everything back to the cabin. The systematic approach was revealing patterns that Duke's random collecting had obscured. The artifact distribution wasn't random at all. It followed clear areas of concentration that suggested specific activity zones. Pottery fragments clustered near what appeared to be ancient hearth areas marked by concentrations of fire-cracked rock. Stone tools accumulated near outcroppings where raw materials would have been readily available. And everywhere, scattered through the careful layers of desert soil, were the small, intimate details of daily life lived long ago. On this particular morning, Ray was working a square meter that had already yielded several pottery fragments and what Sarah had identified as a hide-scraping tool. He'd learned to recognize the subtle color and texture differences that indicated artifact-bearing soil, and his practiced eye caught something that made him pause. "Sarah, take a look at this." She moved over from her own excavation square, and it knelt beside him. Ray had exposed what appeared to be a piece of bone, but as they carefully cleaned around it with soft brushes, the object revealed itself to be something much more significant. It was a needle carved from the leg bone of what Sarah identified as a deer, polished smooth by countless hours of use. One end had been carefully shaped to a sharp point, while the other had been hollowed out to create an eye for thread. Along the shaft, someone had carved a series of delicate geometric patterns that served no functional purpose. They were purely decorative, evidence of an artist who had taken pride in creating something beautiful as well as useful. Ray held the needle up to the morning light, marveling at its weight and balance. "Someone made this for their wife," he said quietly, "or their daughter. It wasn't just a tool, it was a gift." Sarah nodded, her own voice softened by the intimacy of the discovery. "Look at the wear patterns on the point. This saw years of use. Whoever owned it probably made most of their family's clothing. Moccasins, perhaps decorated clothing for ceremonies. This needle was part of someone's daily life for a very long time." Ray found himself thinking about Margaret's sewing basket, still sitting untouched in their bedroom closet. She'd had a collection of needles and thread, buttons and fabric scraps that she'd accumulated over decades of mending and creating. The bone needle in his hands connected him to Margaret's world in a way he hadn't expected. Two women separated by centuries but united by the universal human need to create, to mend, to make beautiful things that would last. As they documented the needle's position and photographed it from multiple angles, Sarah began sharing what she'd learned about the daily lives of the people who had lived here. The archaeological evidence suggested a sophisticated understanding of seasonal cycles, with the site probably occupied during the cooler months when desert water sources were most reliable and game animals concentrated in predictable locations. They weren't just surviving, Sarah explained as they cleaned the needle in the shade structure. They were thriving. The variety of artifacts we're finding suggests people with leisure time for artistic expression, specialized craftspeople, who could devote significant time to perfecting techniques like this bone carving. Ray had started bringing lunch for both of them, and their midday breaks had become opportunities for longer conversations about the site and its implications. Sarah had a gift for bringing the past to life through small details, explaining how the grinding stone would have been used to process mesquite pods into flour, how the various pottery vessels would have served different functions in food preparation and storage, how the placement of hearths suggested family groups sharing cooking areas while maintaining separate sleeping spaces. What happened to them? Ray asked one afternoon as they sat in the shade, sharing sandwiches and watching Duke chase lizards. Why did they leave? Sarah's expression grew more serious. That's the question we're hoping the site will help answer. There's evidence throughout the Southwest of significant population movements and cultural changes during the late prehistoric period. Climate shifts, resource depletion, social conflicts, possibly all of the above. But without more extensive excavation, it's difficult to determine what specifically affected this particular community. Ray had been learning to read the landscape differently, to see evidence of human modification that he'd previously overlooked. Sarah had pointed out areas where the natural drainage had been subtly altered to concentrate seasonal rainfall, depressions that might have been ancient storage pits, and alignments of stones that could represent the foundations of structures long since weathered away. The work was changing him in ways he hadn't anticipated. For the first time since Margaret's death, he had a sense of purpose that extended beyond simple maintenance and survival. Each morning brought the possibility of new discoveries, new insights into the lives of people who had faced many of the same challenges he confronted daily: isolation, harsh weather, the constant need to find and conserve water in an unforgiving environment. But there was something else developing as well, a friendship with Sarah that surprised him with its ease and natural rhythm. Despite the difference in their ages and backgrounds, they worked together with the comfortable efficiency of people who understood each other's strengths and respected each other's knowledge. Sarah never talked down to him or dismissed his observations, while Ray found himself appreciating her combination of scientific rigor and genuine passion for understanding the past. One evening, as they finished cataloging the day's finds, Sarah looked up from her field notes with an expression Ray had learned to recognize as the prelude to an important observation. Ray, I want you to know that this site is unlike anything I've worked on before, not just because of the artifact density or preservation, but because of the way we're approaching it. Most archaeological projects are driven by academic deadlines and funding pressures. We're able to take our time to really listen to what the site is telling us. That's a rare privilege in this field. Ray nodded, understanding what she meant. He'd spent his working life under similar pressures, schedules set by cattle breeding cycles, weather windows, and market demands. Having the freedom to work at their own pace, to follow interesting leads without external pressure, was indeed a rare luxury. As the weeks passed, Ray found himself thinking less about his own legacy and more about the continuity of human presence on this land. He was just the latest in a long line of people who had called this place home, and that realization brought him a sense of connection he hadn't felt since Margaret's death. The child's toy changed everything for Ray. He found it on a Tuesday morning, in early October, when the desert air finally carried a hint of the coming winter. They'd been excavating what Sarah believed was a family dwelling area, working carefully through layers of debris that told the story of long occupation. Ray had become skilled at recognizing the subtle differences between natural soil and the organic rich dirt that indicated human habitation, and his trowel had just struck something that felt different from the usual pottery fragments or stone. Tools! As he carefully exposed the object, Ray realized he was looking at a small clay figurine, no more than 3 inches tall. It depicted a 4-legged animal, possibly a deer or rabbit, with exaggerated features that spoke of a child's imagination rather than an adult's precision. One leg was missing, probably broken off centuries ago, but the rest of the figure remained remarkably intact. Ray sat back on his heels and stared at the tiny sculpture, overwhelmed by an emotion he couldn't quite name. In his hands was something that had once been precious to a child, a toy created with love and patience by someone who wanted to bring joy to a young life. He could imagine small hands playing with this figurine, creating stories and adventures, perhaps mourning when it was eventually lost or broken. "Sarah!" he called, his voice slightly unsteady. "You need to see this." When Sarah examined the figurine, her own expression softened with the same recognition that had affected Ray. "This is beautiful," she said quietly. "Look at the care that went into making it. See how the clay was smoothed and polished. Someone spent significant time creating this for a child they loved." They worked in contemplative silence for the rest of the morning, but Ray found his attention constantly drawn back to the small figurine. Every pottery fragment and stone tool took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of family life. These weren't just the remnants of ancient people pursuing survival strategies. They were the debris of daily life lived by parents and children, grandparents and cousins, people who loved and worried and hoped just as he had. During their lunch break, Sarah began sharing stories from her research that brought the site's former inhabitants to life in ways Ray hadn't expected. She described seasonal rounds that might have brought extended families together during certain times of the year, elaborate ceremonies that marked important transitions in community life, and child-rearing practices that emphasized both practical skills and cultural knowledge. Children in these communities weren't just small adults, Sarah explained, carefully cleaning dust from the figurine with a soft brush. They had their own sphere of activity, their own games and stories and learning processes. This toy suggests a childhood that included play, imagination, and the kind of security that comes from being part of a stable, nurturing community. Ray thought about his own childhood on his grandfather's small ranch outside Tucson. He'd had toy horses carved from wood, miniature cattle fashioned from clay, imaginary games that prepared him for the working life he'd eventually inherit. The parallel struck him forcefully. Across centuries and cultures, parents had been creating toys that reflected their hopes for their children's futures. What kind of life would that child have had? Ray asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. Probably quite rich by the standards of any era. These communities typically emphasized extended family networks, intensive knowledge of the natural world, sophisticated technologies for food production and storage. Children would have learned by participating in adult activities, gathering plant foods, helping with pottery making, observing hunting and tool-making techniques. She gestured toward the broader excavation area. The artifact diversity we're finding suggests a community with enough stability and surplus to support artistic expression, specialized craftsmanship, and the kind of leisurely pursuits that create toys like this. These weren't people struggling for basic survival. They were people with time to play, to create, to enjoy life. That evening, as Ray sat on his porch with the figurine resting on the table beside him, he found himself confronting questions about his own relationship to this land that he'd never thought to ask. His family had owned this property for only 6 years, a blink of an eye compared to the centuries or millennia that the previous inhabitants had called it home. What right did he have to consider himself the true steward of this place? The legal documents that established his ownership were clear and unambiguous, but they suddenly seemed remarkably shallow compared to the deep history he was uncovering. His deed traced ownership back only to the late 1800s, when the land had been claimed under the Homestead Act by a family named Morrison, who had apparently never succeeded in establishing a working farm. Before that, the official record showed nothing, as if the land had been empty, waiting for the first real inhabitants to arrive and put it to productive use. But the child's toy in his hands told a different story entirely. It spoke of generations, of families who had known every water source, every seasonal plant cycle, every animal migration pattern. People who had developed sustainable technologies for living in this harsh environment and had passed that knowledge down through countless generations of children who had played with clay figurines while learning the skills they would need as adults. Ray began to feel the weight of responsibility in a new way. He wasn't just discovering artifacts, he was uncovering evidence of a community whose descendants might still exist, might still have cultural and spiritual connections to this place that transcended any legal ownership papers. "Sarah," he said the next morning as they prepared to resume excavation, "do you know anything about the tribes that live in this area today? Are there people who might have ancestors connected to this site?" Sarah's expression grew more serious. "That's a complicated question, Ray. Several contemporary tribal groups have historical connections to this region. The Tohono O'odham, various Apache bands, the Akchin community. Determining specific ancestral relationships to archaeological sites requires careful consultation with tribal historians and cultural experts." She paused in setting up their equipment. "Are you thinking about contacting them?" Ray wasn't sure how to answer. The thought of reaching out to tribal representatives felt both necessary and terrifying. Necessary because these people deserve to know about the discovery of what might be their ancestral site. Terrifying because such contact would inevitably lead to questions about the site's future that Ray wasn't sure he was ready to answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me feels like this discovery doesn't really belong to me, you know? I just happened to be the one living here when Duke started bringing things home, but another part of me worries about what happens if word gets out. Will my property become some kind of public site? Will I lose control over my own land?" Sarah nodded understandingly. "Those are legitimate concerns, Timot. But I think you should know that most tribal communities are primarily interested in ensuring respectful treatment of ancestral sites, not in taking land away from property owners. Often, the best outcomes involve collaboration between landowners, researchers, and tribal representatives to develop management plans that honor both cultural values and property rights." As they worked that morning, carefully expanding their excavation around the area where the figurine had been found, Ray found himself hoping they would discover more evidence of the children who had once played here. Each artifact felt like a conversation across time, and he was beginning to understand that the real treasure wasn't the objects themselves, but the stories they told about human resilience, creativity, and the universal desire to create homes and families and futures worth preserving. The Spanish colonial coin lay in Ray's palm like an accusation. They'd found it that morning in what Sarah had identified as a burn layer, a stratum of ash and charcoal that suggested the rapid destruction of structures by fire. The excavation had been revealing increasingly disturbing evidence over the past week. Pottery vessels smashed and scattered rather than carefully buried, stone tools abandoned in place as if their owners had fled suddenly. And now this burn layer that spoke of violence rather than the gradual abandonment Ray had been imagining. The coin was silver, badly tarnished, but still clearly readable. Sarah had identified it immediately as a Spanish reel, dated 1692, minted in Mexico City during the height of Spanish colonial expansion into the Northern Territories. It was exactly the kind of artifact that archaeologists dreaded finding in indigenous sites, physical evidence of the violent collision between cultures that had reshaped the entire Southwest. "This changes our interpretation of the site completely," Sarah said quietly, her usual enthusiasm replaced by somber professionalism. She was photographing the coin in situ, documenting its exact position within the burn layer. We're not looking at gradual abandonment due to climate or resource issues. This was sudden, catastrophic, and almost certainly violent. Ray stared at the small silver disc, trying to process what it meant. For weeks, he'd been imagining the site's former inhabitants as people who had lived full, successful lives before moving on to other locations when circumstances required. The idea that their peaceful community had been destroyed, possibly by Spanish military expeditions or settler militias, transformed his entire understanding of what they were uncovering. "How many people would have lived here?" Ray asked. Sarah surveyed the excavation area, calculating, based on the extent of the site and the density of artifacts, probably 30 to 50 individuals, multiple extended families, children, elders, everyone. The implications hit Ray like a physical blow. This wasn't just archaeological evidence, it was the scene of a massacre, or at minimum, the destruction of an entire community of families who had called this place home for generations. The child's toy they'd found took on a horrifying new significance. Had its young owner escaped, been taken? Ray didn't want to pursue those thoughts, but they insisted on surfacing. As they continued excavating around the burn layer, the evidence of sudden abandonment mounted. Personal items left behind suggested people had fled with only what they could carry. Food preparation areas showed signs of interruption. Grinding stones left with unfinished meal preparation. Pottery vessels still containing charred remnants of their last contents. But it was what Sarah found in the afternoon that truly shattered Ray's sense of connection to the site. Working in a grid square about 20 feet from where they'd found the coin, she uncovered a piece of iron that she initially thought might be part of a Spanish weapon or tool. But as she cleaned it more carefully, the object revealed itself to be something far more personal and devastating. It was a branding iron, crude but unmistakable, bearing the initials MC. Ray felt the blood drain from his face as Sarah held up the iron for his examination. MC could stand for many things, but given the colonial context and the location, the most obvious interpretation was deeply personal. Morrison Cavanaugh, his own family name, or something very close to it. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above. A whisper. "My great-great-grandfather's name was Marcus Cavanaugh. He came to Arizona Territory in the 1870s. Sarah's expression grew grave as she understood the implications. "Ray, this branding iron predates your great-great-grandfather by almost 2 centuries. But if there's a family connection—" Ray sank down onto a nearby boulder, his legs suddenly unsteady. The possibility that he was looking at evidence of his own family's involvement in the destruction of this community was almost too overwhelming to process. He'd always known that his family's presence in Arizona was relatively recent, but he'd never considered what that might have meant for the people who were already here. Margaret had done extensive genealogical research during the early years of their marriage, tracing both their family lines back several generations. Ray remembered her excitement when she discovered that his family had been among the early Anglo settlers in Arizona Territory, part of the wave of ranchers and miners who had opened up the region for development. The family stories spoke of hardy pioneers who had carved successful lives out of harsh wilderness, but they'd never mentioned what had happened to the people who had been living successfully in that same wilderness for thousands of years. "We need to stop the excavation," Ray said suddenly. "We're desecrating a crime scene." Sarah looked up from where she was carefully documenting the branding iron's position. "Ray, I understand this is difficult, but archaeological evidence like this is exactly why proper excavation and documentation are so important. This site could provide crucial evidence about an historical injustice that has been largely undocumented in the official historical record. But what if my family was involved in that injustice? What if I'm the descendant of the people who destroyed this community? How can I justify digging up evidence of my own ancestors' crimes?" Sarah set down her tools and came over to sit beside Ray on the boulder. "First, we don't know that your family was directly involved. The branding iron could have belonged to associates, other settlers, or could even have been traded or stolen. Second, even if there is a family connection, that doesn't make you responsible for actions taken centuries before your birth." She gestured toward the excavation area. "But it might make you uniquely positioned to help ensure that this community's story is told truthfully and respectfully. Most archaeological sites from this period are investigated by people with no personal connection to the events. You have the opportunity to approach this with a sense of personal responsibility that goes beyond academic interest." Ray spent the rest of the afternoon sitting alone on his porch, while Sarah finished documenting the day's finds. Duke sensed his mood and lay quietly at his feet, occasionally nuzzling his hand with concerned affection. The desert landscape that had felt like home for 6 years now seemed charged with history and guilt. Every rise and depression in the terrain might hide evidence of violence. Every peaceful sunset might be illuminating ground where people had died defending their homes. That evening, Ray called Mrs. Henderson and asked if she could drive him into town the next day. He needed to visit the County Historical Society and the library to research his family's history in Arizona more thoroughly than Margaret's genealogical research had attempted. If his ancestors had been involved in the destruction of the indigenous community, he needed to know the full truth. Sarah had offered to suspend the excavation until Ray was ready to continue, but he'd asked her to proceed with documenting and protecting what they'd already found. Whatever his family's role in the site's history, the artifacts deserved proper care and preservation. The people who had created them deserved to have their stories told, even if those stories reflected poorly on Ray's own heritage. As he prepared for bed that night, Ray found himself thinking about legacy in an entirely new way. For weeks, he'd been excited about his connection to the site, feeling that his discovery of the artifacts gave him a special relationship to the land and its history. Now he was confronting the possibility that his family's relationship to this place was based on violence and displacement rather than the pioneering spirit he'd always been taught to admire. The child's clay figurine sat on his kitchen table, and Ray wondered if its young owner had survived whatever catastrophe had destroyed the community. Had they grown up in exile, telling their own children about the home they'd lost? Were there families today who still carried stories about this place passed down through generations of forced migration and cultural suppression? For the first time since beginning the excavation, Ray wondered if he had any right to be here at all. The phone call came on a Thursday morning in late October, just as Ray was preparing for another day of excavation. The voice was measured and impolite, but Ray could hear the underlying tension even through the crackling satellite connection. "Mr. Kavanaugh, my name is Joseph Yazzie. I'm a cultural preservation officer with the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. We've heard about the archaeological work being conducted on your property, and we'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss the site." Ray's hands began to shake slightly as he gripped the phone. Word had gotten out despite their attempts at discretion. Over the past month, he'd researched his family history extensively, learning details about early Anglo settlement patterns that Margaret's genealogical research had glossed over. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling. A pattern of land acquisition that had rarely been entirely legal or ethical, regardless of what the official records claimed. "How did you hear about our work?" Ray asked. "Information travels in small communities, Mr. Kavanaugh, especially when it concerns sites that may have cultural significance to our people. We're not here to create problems, but we do have a responsibility to ensure that ancestral sites are treated with appropriate respect." They arranged to meet the following Tuesday. Joseph Yazzie would be accompanied by Dr. Maria Santos, a tribal historian, and Robert Johnson, a representative from the tribal council. Sarah had immediately contacted her department chair at ASU, who had insisted on sending Dr. Frank Morrison, a senior archaeologist with experience in Native American consultation protocols. The weekend gave Ray time to prepare, but also to worry. He'd spent hours walking the excavation site, trying to see it through the eyes of people whose ancestors might have lived and died there. The careful grid squares and measured documentation that had seemed so professional and respectful now felt invasive and presumptuous. Who was he to expose the private lives of people who had never given permission for such intrusion? On Monday morning, Sarah arrived earlier than usual, her typical confidence replaced by obvious nervousness. "Ray, there's something else we need to discuss before tomorrow's meeting. Something we found yesterday that I didn't want to mention over the phone." She led him to a new excavation area where she'd been working alone while Ray dealt with his family research. In the center of a carefully mapped grid square lay the remains of what appeared to be a leather bundle, partially preserved by the arid climate. Most of the organic material had deteriorated, but fragments of hide, beadwork, and what looked like plant materials were still visible. "It's a medicine bundle," Sarah said quietly, "or what's left of one. These were sacred objects, Ray, deeply personal spiritual items that contained materials specific to individual ceremonies and healing practices. Finding one here suggests this wasn't just a habitation site, it was a place of spiritual significance." Ray stared at the fragmented remains, understanding immediately that they had crossed a line he hadn't even known existed. Medicine bundles. They weren't museum artifacts or archaeological specimens. They were living spiritual objects, as sacred to their creators as crucifixes or prayer books would be to Christian families. The fact that one had been left behind during the site's destruction spoke to the catastrophic nature of whatever had happened here. "We can't excavate this," Ray said. "This needs to be reburied immediately." Sarah nodded, her relief evident. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've documented its location and photographed it for the record, but you're absolutely right. This isn't something that should be disturbed further without explicit permission from people who understand its spiritual significance." They spent the morning carefully covering the medicine bundle remains with clean sand and marking the location for future reference. The work felt ceremonial rather than scientific, and Ray found himself thinking about Margaret's funeral, about the importance of treating sacred things with proper reverence especially when, you didn't fully understand their meaning. Tuesday morning arrived grey and cold, with the kind of weather that made the desert feel more like the high country where Ray had spent his early ranching years. The visitors arrived in 2 vehicles, a tribal council truck carrying the Native American representatives and Dr. Morrison's university sedan. Ray and Sarah met them at the cabin, where Ray had set up chairs on the porch and prepared coffee for everyone. Joseph Yazzie was a man perhaps Ray's own age, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. Dr. Santos appeared to be in her 40s, with the focused attention of an academic accustomed to difficult conversations. Robert Johnson was younger, maybe 35, but carried himself with the quiet authority of someone comfortable with leadership responsibilities. Dr. Morrison was a surprise. Ray had expected another version of Sarah, but Morrison was a tall, heavy-set man in his 60s who seemed more comfortable in a boardroom than a desert excavation site. His handshake was firm but perfunctory, and his eyes immediately began assessing the property with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating real estate values. "Mr. Kavanaugh," Joseph Yazzie began once everyone was seated, "we appreciate your willingness to meet with us. We understand this situation is complicated, and we want to approach it in a way that respects everyone's interests." "Before we go any further," Ray interrupted, "I need to tell you something that might change this entire conversation." He pulled out the folder of family research he'd compiled over the past weeks and explained what he'd learned about his ancestors' role in early territorial settlement. The revelation about the branding iron found at the site drew sharp glances between the tribal representatives, but their expressions remained carefully neutral. "Mr. Kavanaugh," Dr. Santos said when Ray finished, "we appreciate your honesty about your family history, but you should understand that we're not here to relitigate 19th century land conflicts. We're here to discuss how to properly care for what appears to be an ancestral site of significant cultural importance." Robert Johnson leaned forward in his chair. "What we'd like to understand is the current status of the excavation and your intentions for the site going forward. Dr. Martinez has indicated that you've been conducting careful, respectful work, but we need to assess whether continued excavation is appropriate." Sarah described their methodology and findings, carefully avoiding mention of the medicine bundle remains, but emphasizing the evidence of sudden, violent abandonment. Dr. Morrison took extensive notes and asked detailed questions about artifact preservation and documentation protocols. "The site has clear research value," Morrison said finally. "The preservation is exceptional, and the historical context could contribute significantly to our understanding of colonial period impacts on indigenous communities. However, I understand there are cultural sensitivities that need to be addressed." Joseph Yazzi's response was measured but firm. "Dr. Morrison, what you call research value, we call ancestral remains and sacred objects. The distinction matters. This isn't an academic exercise for us. It's about the appropriate treatment of our ancestors' homes and possessions." The conversation continued for nearly 3 hours, with each party presenting their perspectives and concerns. Ray found himself in the unexpected position of mediator, trying to balance Sarah's scientific enthusiasm, Morrison's academic agenda, and the tribal representatives' cultural obligations. But it was Dr. Santos who finally articulated what Ray had been struggling to understand. "Mr. Kavanaugh, the question isn't whether you have the legal right to excavate this site. You do. The question is whether excavation is the right thing to do, and whether there are ways to honor this place that don't require disturbing what remains of our ancestors' lives." As the meeting drew toward its close, Ray realized that everyone was waiting for him to make a decision that would affect far more than just his own property. The site had become a symbol of larger questions about historical justice, cultural preservation, and the responsibilities that came with land ownership in a region where legal title and moral claim didn't always align. "I need some time to think about all this," Ray said finally. "Can we schedule another meeting for next week? I want to make sure I understand all the options before making any decisions." As the visitors prepared to leave, Joseph Yazzie approached Ray privately. "Mr. Kavanaugh, I want you to know that whatever your ancestors may have done, we judge people by their own actions. What matters to us is how you choose to handle this situation now that you know the full story." That evening, as Ray sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint familiar mountains in shades of purple and gold, he realized that his quiet retirement had become something he'd never expected, a test of character that would define how he wanted to be remembered by the people who came after him. The second meeting took place at the Salt River tribal offices in a conference room that smelled of sage and new carpet. Ray had spent the intervening week walking his property daily, sometimes alone and sometimes with Duke, trying to understand what the right decision might look like. Sarah had suspended all excavation work, covering their dig sites with tarps and protective barriers while they waited for resolution. On the morning before the meeting, Duke had brought Ray one final artifact, a fragment of carved stone that Sarah immediately recognized as part of a ceremonial pipe bowl. The carving was exquisite, depicting what appeared to be a bird in flight, its wings spread across the curve of the bowl. It was clearly the work of a master craftsperson, someone who had spent years perfecting their skill. "This changes things again," Sarah had said as they examined the pipe fragment. Ceremonial pipes weren't just functional objects, they were central to spiritual and social practices. Finding one here confirms that this was a place of significant cultural importance, not just a seasonal camp. Now, sitting in the tribal conference room, surrounded by more people than Ray had expected, he felt the weight of that pipe fragment in his jacket pocket, like a physical reminder of the responsibility he carried. In addition to the original participants, the meeting included additional tribal council members, a representative from the Arizona State Museum, and a legal advisor from the university. Dr. Morrison opened the meeting with a presentation about the site's archaeological significance, complete with slides and charts that reduced the lives Ray had been imagining into data points and statistical analyses. Ray watched the faces of the tribal representatives as Morrison spoke, noting their polite but increasingly distant expressions. When Morrison finished, Joseph Yazzie responded with his own presentation about the cultural and spiritual significance of ancestral sites. He spoke about the ongoing connections between contemporary tribal communities and the places where their ancestors had lived, about the responsibilities that came with caring for sacred spaces, and about the trauma that inappropriate handling of such sites could cause to living communities. "This isn't about taking anyone's property," Yazzie concluded. "It's about finding ways to honor our ancestors while respecting current legal ownership. We're hoping for a collaborative solution that serves everyone's interests." Ray had been dreading this moment, but when it came time for him to speak, he found that his decision had crystallized during Yazzie's presentation. He stood up slowly, his arthritic knees protesting, and reached into his pocket for the pipe fragment. "Before I say anything else, I want to return this to you." He placed the carved stone on the conference table, where it seemed to draw all the light in the room. "Duke found it yesterday morning. It's beautiful and it doesn't belong to me." He took a deep breath and looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes in turn. "I've done a lot of thinking over the past week, and I've reached a decision that some of you aren't going to like. I want to deed the archaeological area, about 15 acres of my property, to the Salt River community." The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Morrison's face went through several color changes before settling on an unhappy red. The university legal advisor began shuffling through papers with obvious agitation, but the tribal representative sat very still, waiting for Ray to continue. "I can't undo what my ancestors may have done," Ray said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "But I can make sure that this place is protected and honored by people who understand its true significance. That's not me, and it's not the university. It's you." "Mr. Kavanaugh," Dr. Morrison interrupted, "I don't think you understand the research value you'd be sacrificing. This site could contribute decades of important academic work. You can't just give away scientific opportunities based on emotional reactions." Ray turned to face Morrison directly. "Dr. Morrison, with all due respect, you just spent 20 minutes talking about this place like it was a collection of objects instead of someone's home. These people didn't live here to provide you with research opportunities. They lived here because it was their land, their community, their sacred space. If anyone has the right to decide how it should be treated, it's their descendants." Robert Johnson spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "Mr. Kavanaugh, this is an extraordinary gesture, but we need to make sure you understand what you're proposing. Deeding land to the tribe is a complex legal process with significant implications for you and for us." "I understand that," Ray replied. "I've already spoken with my own attorney. It will take time to work out the details, but I'm committed to making it happen." The university representatives spent the next hour arguing against Ray's decision, presenting various compromise proposals that would allow continued academic access while acknowledging tribal concerns. But Ray had made up his mind, and the tribal representatives seemed to understand that his decision was final. As the meeting broke up, Dr. Santos approached Ray with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Kavanaugh, I want you to know that what you're doing today will mean something to our children and their children. Not many people have the courage to choose what's right over what's convenient." Walking back to his truck, Ray felt lighter than he had in weeks, despite knowing that the hardest conversations were still ahead of him. 3 weeks later, while the lawyers worked through the complexities of land transfer, Duke made his most significant discovery yet. Ray had been walking the boundary of the area he planned to deed to the tribe, trying to understand the full extent of what he was giving up, when Duke suddenly stopped and began digging with unusual intensity near a cluster of desert willow trees. The location was about 100 yards from their main excavation site, in an area they hadn't yet explored. "What you got there, boy?" Ray called, walking over to investigate. Duke had uncovered something flat and deliberately placed, a stone slab that had been carefully positioned and was clearly not a natural rock formation. Ray knelt down and began carefully clearing away the accumulated desert debris, revealing what was unmistakably a burial marker. The stone was sandstone, probably quarried from outcroppings several miles away, and it bore carved symbols that Ray didn't recognize, but clearly understood to be meaningful. The markings weren't random. They formed deliberate patterns that suggested names, dates, or other memorial information rendered in a writing system that had been lost, along with the people who created it. Ray sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the realization of what Duke had found. They weren't just looking at a habitation site, they were looking at a cemetery, a place where families had buried their loved ones with care and ceremony, marking their graves with stones that were meant to honor their memory for generations. He called Sarah immediately, and she arrived within an hour, accompanied by Joseph Yazzie and Dr. Santos. The tribal representatives had been staying in Phoenix, while the legal details were worked out, and Ray had asked them to be involved in any new discoveries, given the cultural sensitivity of the site. "This changes everything," Sarah said quietly, as they examined the burial marker. "We're not dealing with an archaeological site anymore. We're dealing with a cemetery that may still contain human remains. All excavation has to stop immediately until we can determine the extent of the burial area." Joseph Yazzie knelt beside the marker and spoke softly in a language Ray didn't recognize, a prayer or blessing, Ray realized. When he finished, he looked up with an expression that mixed grief and determination. "Mr. Kavanaugh, this discovery makes your decision to transfer the land even more important. This is a sacred burial ground. Our ancestors are still here, still connected to this place. They need to be protected, not excavated." Over the next several days, working with ground-penetrating radar equipment borrowed from the university, they identified at least 12 additional burial sites in the immediate area. The cemetery was larger and more extensive than anyone had imagined, suggesting that the habitation site had been not just a seasonal camp, but a permanent community that had buried multiple generations in this location. Dr. Santos spent hours documenting the burial markers, working with tribal elders to interpret the symbolic carvings. What emerged was a picture of a sophisticated memorial system that recorded not just individual deaths, but family relationships and community connections that stretched back centuries. "These aren't just graves," Dr. Santos explained to Ray as they stood among the scattered markers. "They're a record of an entire community's history. The symbols tell us about marriages, births, deaths, seasonal ceremonies, successful hunts, failed harvests, everything that mattered to the people who lived here." The discovery of the cemetery also provided the final piece of evidence about what had happened to the community. The most recent burials showed signs of having been disturbed or damaged, consistent with the kind of desecration that often accompanied violent conflicts during the colonial period. Some markers had been deliberately broken, others showed evidence of having been moved from their original positions. "They tried to destroy even our dead," Joseph Yazzie said, his voice heavy with old grief. But they didn't succeed completely. Enough survived to tell the story. The legal transfer of the land accelerated once the burial ground was confirmed. No one wanted to be seen as standing in the way of proper treatment of ancestral remains, and even Dr. Morrison withdrew his objections to Ray's decision. On a clear morning in December, the formal ceremony transferring the land took place at the site itself. Tribal elders led prayers in multiple languages, burning sage and sweetgrass while asking the ancestors for forgiveness for the disturbances that had occurred and promising proper protection for the future. Ray found himself deeply moved by the ceremony, understanding that he was witnessing something much larger than a simple land transfer. He was participating in the healing of an historical wound, the restoration of a sacred place to people who had never stopped considering it home. As the tribal chairman accepted the deed, and Ray officially relinquished ownership of the 15-acre parcel, he felt not loss, but completion. This land had never really belonged to him. He had simply been its temporary caretaker until it could be returned to its proper guardians. Duke seemed to understand the significance of the moment, sitting quietly at Ray's side as the ceremony concluded with songs that had probably been sung at this same spot centuries earlier. The dog had started it all with his instinct for finding treasures, but Ray realized now that the real treasure had been the opportunity to do the right thing when it mattered most. 6 months later, Ray stood beside the new memorial marker that had been erected at the entrance to what was now officially designated as the Kavanaugh Santos Memorial Site. The marker was made of black granite, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the desert sky, and bore inscriptions in 3 languages: English, Spanish, and O'odham. At the top, carved in simple letters, were the words, "In memory of those who called this place home." Below that, the inscription continued, "This sacred burial ground and the surrounding archaeological site are protected in perpetuity for the education and spiritual needs of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community and all people who seek to understand the rich cultural heritage of this land, dedicated through the generosity of Raymond and Margaret Kavanaugh, with gratitude for their commitment to healing historical wounds and honoring ancestral connections." Ray traced the letters of Margaret's name with his finger, knowing she would have approved of what had transpired here. She had always believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult, and he could almost hear her voice telling him he'd finally learned something worth knowing. The site had been transformed over the past months into something that served multiple purposes while maintaining its essential character as a place of reverence and learning. A small visitor center had been constructed near the original excavation area, designed to blend seamlessly with the desert landscape and powered entirely by solar panels. Inside, carefully curated displays told the story of the site's discovery and the people who had lived here, using replicas of artifacts while the originals remained in tribal custody. But the most significant change wasn't visible to casual visitors. The burial ground had been restored and protected with traditional ceremonies, the scattered markers carefully repositioned according to tribal protocols, and the entire cemetery area enclosed by a low fence of desert stone that marked it as sacred space. Only tribal members and invited guests were permitted in the burial area, ensuring that the ancestors could rest in peace while still allowing for appropriate memorial observances. Ray's role had evolved in ways he never could have anticipated. Officially, he was the site's volunteer caretaker and educational coordinator, responsible for maintaining the grounds and leading guided tours for school groups and interested visitors. The job came with a small salary funded by a combination of tribal resources and grants from cultural preservation organizations, enough to supplement his modest retirement income while giving him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Margaret's death. Unofficially, he had become something like the site's guardian and interpreter, someone who could speak to visitors about the complex emotions and ethical questions that archaeological discoveries raised. His own journey from accidental discoverer to committed advocate for indigenous rights resonated with many people who visited the site, struggling with their own questions about heritage, responsibility, and the weight of historical injustice. Sarah had taken a position with the Tribal Cultural Department, splitting her time between the memorial site and other preservation projects throughout the region. Her relationship with Ray had deepened into the kind of friendship that bridged generational and cultural differences through shared commitment to important work. They still spent their mornings working together, though now their focus was on educational programming and visitor services rather than excavation. Duke, now 9 years old and showing more grey in his muzzle, had been officially designated as the site's chief archaeological consultant, a title that came with a brass nameplate and the unofficial responsibility of greeting visitors and occasionally demonstrating his artifact-finding skills for impressed school children. He seemed to understand the importance of his role, carrying himself with new dignity while maintaining his enthusiasm for desert exploration. The transformation in Ray's life went far beyond his work at the memorial site. Through his involvement with the tribal community, he had discovered a network of relationships and responsibilities that gave new meaning to his retirement years. He attended tribal council meetings when site-related issues were discussed, participated in seasonal ceremonies when invited, and had become something of an advocate for other archaeological sites threatened by development or neglect. Most surprisingly, he had begun learning O'odham language in weekly classes offered at the Tribal Cultural Center. At 73, Ray was discovering that his capacity for learning new things hadn't disappeared with retirement. It had simply been waiting for something that truly captured his interest and imagination. On this particular morning, Ray was preparing for a visit from a group of high school students who were studying the intersection of history, archaeology, and social justice. These educational visits had become one of his favorite aspects of the work, providing opportunities to share not just the facts about the site, but the personal transformation that discovering it had catalyzed in his own life. As he walked through the memorial grounds, checking that everything was ready for the students' arrival, Ray reflected on the strange turns that life could take. A year ago, he had been a lonely widower marking time in the desert, his days structured around basic maintenance and solitary reflection. Duke's simple habit of bringing home interesting rocks had led to discoveries that changed not just Ray's understanding of his property, but his understanding of his place in the larger story of this land. The sound of approaching vehicles drew his attention to the access road, where a school bus was raising its familiar cloud of dust. Ray straightened his shirt and walked toward the visitor center, Duke trotting beside him with the alert expression of someone who knew important work was about to begin. As the students began filing off the bus, chattering with the nervous energy of teenagers on a field trip, Ray caught sight of the new marker one more time. The inscription reminded him that healing historical wounds wasn't a one-time action, but an ongoing commitment that required constant attention and care. He had learned, at an age when most people assumed their learning was finished, that the most important discoveries often came not from seeking new landscapes, but from seeing familiar places with new eyes. The desert that had seemed empty and finished when he first retired now revealed itself daily, as layered with stories, meanings, and connections that would take more than one lifetime to fully understand. But that was all right. Ray had time, purpose, and the kind of work that would matter long after he was gone. And somewhere in the quiet moments between sunrise and the heat of the day, he could still imagine Margaret's voice telling him he'd done good.